You know, when they finally sent us home, when I finally stepped off that plane in Dayton and smelled real Ohio air, not dust and diesel, I thought the hardest part was over. I really did. I thought Aries and we'd done our tour, we'd paid the price, and now it was time for the quiet life. You hear about guys struggling to adjust, sure, but I figured I had an advantage. I had Aries. Aries isn't just a dog, you understand. He's a partner. A four-legged, 90-pound Belgian Malinois who wore a Kevlar vest more often than I wore a clean shirt. He was the reason I was standing there breathing. The reason I didn't step on something nasty that would have ended my story right there in the desert dirt. We were a unit. We shared MREs, we shared foxholes, and we shared the kind of memories you can't ever scrub out of your brain, no matter how much time passes. When we got back to my little ranch house outside Springfield, everything was perfect, or so it seemed. The yard was green, the neighbors' kids were playing catch, and the only loud noise was the ice maker in the freezer. It was boring. Gloriously, beautifully boring. Aries seemed happy for the first few weeks. He loved the freedom. He loved running fences and chasing squirrels that didn't look like they were carrying explosives. He'd sprawl out on the rug in the living room, snoring, looking like a retired general who finally hung up his spurs. But the peace, that deep, heavy quiet that I had craved for 2 years, it didn't last. It started subtly, maybe 3 weeks after we settled back in. I remember looking at the clock. It was 2:37 a.m. That's a bad time in the military. It's the dead zone. Too late to be early, too early to be late. It's when patrols get sloppy and shadows play tricks. I was dead asleep. The kind of sleep where your body finally lets go of the tension. And then I felt it. Aries was sleeping right beside the bed, like always. He was supposed to be my silent alarm, but this time, he was the alarm itself. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just moved. The sound of his claws scraping against the hardwood floor was the first thing that woke me. It wasn't the slow, casual stretch of a dog waking up. It was a coiled, sudden shift, like a spring, being released. I opened my eyes, and the room was dark, but the moonlight filtering through the blinds gave me just enough light to see him. Aries was up, standing motionless. His head was cocked slightly, his ears were rigid, not just pointed but locked, like radar dishes trying to pinpoint a signal. I whispered his name. Aries. Easy, buddy. What is it? He didn't acknowledge me. His entire focus was fixed on the wall facing the backyard. His back was low, the way he always stood when he was scenting or listening for something dangerous in the field. It was the stance of a dog who was ready to bite first and ask questions never. And then I heard it. Nothing. Just the normal sounds of a quiet house at 2:37 a.m. The distant hiss of the furnace turning off. Maybe the gentle sigh of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I reached down and put my hand on his shoulder. Under the thick fur, his muscles were wire-tight. He gave a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't the stranger on the property bark. It was the deep, vibrating sound he used when he was confirming an explosive device. It was pure, focused fear. "There's nothing there, pal," I murmured, rubbing his neck. "Just the wind." I spent 5 minutes trying to calm him down. I even got up and walked around the house checking all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. The yard was empty. Nothing moved. Finally, Aries settled, but he didn't lie down. He sat by the door, watching the darkness with those intense, amber eyes until the sun started to come up. I chalked it up to adjustment. We both had nightmares, right? We both flinched when a car backfired. It was just a post-war jump scare. That's what I told myself. We were both just hyper-alert, maybe hearing phantom noises from overseas. But then it happened again. The next night, 2:37 a.m., same time, almost to the minute. Claw, scrape. Rigid stance. Focused stare. This time, I was ready. I was waiting for the sound that was setting him off. I sat up in bed, straining my own ears until they hurt. I heard the clock ticking. I heard my own heartbeat. I heard absolutely nothing that sounded remotely threatening. Yet Aries was terrified. His reaction was so immediate, so precise, that it couldn't be a random hallucination. Aries was trained to ignore background noise. He could walk through a busy market with horns honking and people yelling, and he wouldn't flinch. But the slightest, almost imperceptible shift in air pressure or a tiny metallic click, that's what he was bred to detect. I started getting nervous, not about what was outside, but about Aries. Was he sick? Did he have a neurological issue? I called his vet, Dr. Peterson, the next morning. "He's reacting to something I can't hear," I explained, trying to sound casual. "Always around the same time. He gets completely locked up, ready to deploy." Dr. Peterson, a nice lady who always smelled faintly of antiseptic and dog treats, listened patiently. "Jake, it's incredibly common for military K-9s to experience heightened sensory perception after returning from high-stress environments. They're wired differently than a family pet. His auditory threshold is far lower than yours. He might be hearing a compressor kicking on miles away, or maybe even high-frequency sounds that humans filter out." She suggested a mild sedative to help him sleep through the night, just for a couple of weeks, to break the cycle. I tried the pills. They knocked him out cold. He was snoring heavily by midnight. I felt guilty, like I was drugging my partner just because I didn't want to deal with his anxiety. But I needed sleep, too, and I needed him to adjust. 2:37 a.m. The house was silent. Aries was a heavy lump of fur beside the bed. And then I felt it again. Not a sound, but a vibration. I sat bolt upright. Aries hadn't moved, but I saw his tail give the slightest twitch. Just a single, involuntary flicker. He was fighting the sedatives, trying to wake up, because whatever sound it was, it had pierced the chemical fog. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb him. I grabbed my phone and activated the audio recorder, holding it up like a microphone in a sound booth. I stood absolutely still, listening to the silence. Shh. Wait, was that it? It was so faint, so fleeting. It was gone before I could place it. It sounded rhythmic. Not like a natural sound like wind or crickets, but manufactured. Like a very, very distant, subtle pulse. I listened harder. Nothing. Reviewed the audio recording immediately. I played it back at maximum volume. All I got was the sound of my own breathing and the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The sound, if it was even there, was too low frequency, or too high, or maybe just too quiet for the phone mic to pick up. The next morning, I was exhausted and frustrated. I told my sister, Sarah, about it. She lives 10 minutes away and she's a nurse. Very practical, very skeptical. "Jake, honey, you need to stop watching the clock," she said, pouring me coffee. "You're wired. You're hypervigilant. You're looking for a threat because that's what you were trained to do. Aries is feeding off your stress." "No, Sarah, you don't understand," I insisted. "Aries is reacting first. He's the one who wakes up, and when I look at him, he's not anxious. He's working. He's in detection mode. It's like he's hearing the same signal every night." She sighed, giving me that concerned, sisterly look that veterans hate. "Maybe you need to talk to someone, Jake. The house is quiet. It's Ohio. The most dangerous thing out there is probably a raccoon in the trash." I knew she meant well, but her dismissal made the isolation worse. She was right, logically. We were safe. This was America. But Aries's reaction was undeniable. He didn't lie. His training was impeccable. If Aries was saying there was a threat, there was a threat. I decided to stop relying on my ears. If the sound wasn't audible to humans, maybe it was a vibration. I started spending my evenings setting up traps. I bought a cheap vibration sensor online, the kind they use for home security systems, and taped it to the windowsill facing the backyard. I also bought a high-quality parabolic microphone, the kind birdwatchers use, and aimed it out the window, connected to a laptop running recording software. I was turning my peaceful suburban ranch house into a mini surveillance outpost, all because my dog kept staring at a wall at 2:37 a.m. That night, I didn't go to sleep. I was camped out in the recliner, laptop glowing in the dark, Aries lying alertly at my feet. I had a thermos of coffee and enough adrenaline to power a small city. Midnight passed. 1:00 a.m. 2:00 a.m. The air in the room got colder as the temperature dropped outside. Every creak of the house settling made me jump. I was acutely aware of the ridiculousness of my situation. I was a decorated veteran, sitting in the dark, waiting for a ghost sound that only my dog could hear. 2:36 a.m. My heart was pounding. I watched the clock tick over to 2:37 a.m. Aries moved, not fast, but with that familiar, terrifying precision. His head rose, his ears locked, and that low, guttural vibration started in his chest. I stared at the laptop screen. The vibration sensor was flatlining. No major tremors. The parabolic mic showed a baseline level of ambient noise, but Aries was reacting. He was staring at the window, his eyes wide and fixed. I leaned forward, trying to separate the silence into individual parts. And then I caught it. It wasn't a thump, it wasn't a chirp, it was more like a very faint, almost electrical whine. It was high-pitched, right on the edge of human hearing, and it pulsed. Whine. Silence. Whine. Silence. Whine. It was incredibly faint, and if Aries hadn't been reacting, I would have dismissed it as tinnitus or a bad fuse in the breaker box. But Aries was focused on it like his life depended on it. I checked the laptop again. Nothing registered on the professional equipment. The sound was so subtle, so specific, that it was below the noise floor of the microphone, or maybe it was a frequency that the gear wasn't designed to capture efficiently. I grabbed the parabolic mic and swung it wildly around the room, hoping to accidentally amplify the source. Aries suddenly lunged, not toward the window, but toward the wall shared with the master bathroom. He hit the drywall with his nose, whimpering slightly, then backed away, shaking his head. It was almost like the sound had moved, or maybe Aries had realized the sound was coming through the structure of the house, not the air. The pulsing whine lasted for exactly 45 seconds. Then, silence. Complete, absolute silence. Aries stood there for another minute, trembling slightly before he finally let out a long, shaky exhale, sinking back onto the floor, but staying alert. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't PTSD. This wasn't a random noise. This was a signal, and Aries recognized it. I spent the next day dissecting the 45 seconds in my memory. What did that sound remind me of? We spent our deployment working EOD sweeps, explosive ordnance disposal. We dealt with a lot of improvised devices. Those things rarely use loud clocks or obvious timers. They use subtle electronic components, capacitors charging, low-frequency acoustic triggers, or radio signals. That rhythmic, pulsing whine. It was electrical. It felt manufactured. It felt like a countdown. I got out a map of my neighborhood. My house is on a half-acre plot, bordered by Mr. Henderson's yard on the left, and a small wooded drainage ditch on the right that leads to the main road. The area Aries kept focusing on was directly behind my house, in the corner near the utility shed. I walked the entire perimeter of the backyard with Aries that afternoon. He was sniffing everything, casual, calm. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary in the daylight. No disturbed earth, no strange wiring, no discarded electronics. I even crawled into the crawl space under the house, checking for loose wiring or structural damage. Nothing. The house was solid, built in the 70s, boringly robust. That night, I moved my surveillance operation outside. I set up the parabolic mic pointing directly at the utility, Shed, connected to a long extension cord running back into the house. I also brought out a professional-grade spectrum analyzer I borrowed from an old tech buddy, something that could detect a wider range of radio frequencies than my phone. I sat in the dark living room, watching the clock tick, feeling the weight of the silence press down on me. Aries was glued to my side, his body radiating that tight, focused tension. 2:37 a.m. Aries rose, immediately. His eyes went wide, and the low growl started. I looked at the laptop screen hooked up to the spectrum analyzer, and there it was. Not an audible sound, but a visual spike. A tiny, perfect rectangular pulse of energy right at the very high end of the acoustic range, bordering on ultrasound. It was a frequency I would never naturally hear, but Aries's sensitive hearing would pick it up perfectly. The pulse was rhythmic, exactly, matching the whine I had barely perceived the night before. It was coming in bursts of 3. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Silence for 5 seconds. Pulse, pulse, pulse. It wasn't random noise, it was intentional. It was a code. I looked at Aries, whose posture had gone from alert to absolute dread. He wasn't just hearing a noise, he was interpreting it, and whatever he was interpreting, it was bad. I quickly checked the parabolic mic recording, volume. It was still picking up nothing but the wind rustling the leaves. The sound was traveling through the ground or the air in a way that acoustic microphones couldn't easily capture, but the spectrum analyzer, which measures energy waves, caught it clearly. I looked at the direction of the spike. It was coming from the backyard, exactly where Aries was focused. Specifically, it was coming from the area where the property line met the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and whispered to Aries, "Stay." He whined, fighting the command, clearly desperate to go with me. "Stay, Aries. I'm just checking the perimeter." I slipped out the back door. The air hit me, cold and damp. I moved slowly, flashlight beam low, sweeping the ground. The grass was wet with dew. I crept toward the utility shed. The pulsing had stopped on the analyzer screen, just like the night before. The 45 seconds were up. I checked behind the shed. Nothing, just spiderwebs and old gardening tools. I moved toward the fence line. Mr. Henderson's house was dark. I reached the corner of the property where my yard dipped down into the small, overgrown drainage ditch. I shone the light into the thick brush, and there, half hidden by a tangle of ivy and weeds, I saw something that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a small, weatherproof box, about the size of a deck of cards, painted dark green to blend into the foliage. A single, thin antenna stuck out of the top, barely visible. It was taped securely to the base of a large oak tree that marked the edge of my property. I knelt down, heart pounding against my ribs, and stared at it. It was a piece of professional-grade electronic equipment. It wasn't a sprinkler timer. It wasn't a weather sensor. It looked exactly like the kind of remote signaling device we trained Aries to detect in the field, the kind used to trigger something else. I carefully reached out and touched the box. It was cold and slightly damp. I could feel a faint, residual warmth near the antenna. Aries knew. He knew the sound, and he knew what the sound meant. I stood up, backing away slowly, flashlight still fixed on the device. I felt a wave of icy realization wash over me. I wasn't paranoid. Aries wasn't having nightmares. Someone had placed a surveillance or signaling device on my property, and it was broadcasting a coded pulse every night at 2:37 a.m. The question wasn't what Aries was hearing anymore. The question was why? Why me? Why here in quiet, boring Ohio? And why was the signal perfectly timed, exactly 45 seconds long, and broadcasting on a frequency engineered to bypass casual detection? I walked back inside, my hands shaking. Aries met me at the door, sniffing my clothes urgently, his tail wagging tentatively now that the threat was gone. "You were right, partner," I whispered, sinking back into the recliner. "You were right the whole time." I looked at the spectrum analyzer screen. The spike was gone. The world was quiet again, but my mind was racing. I couldn't call the local police. I couldn't say, "My military dog heard a silent radio signal on my fence line, and I think it's a bomb trigger." They'd think I was crazy, just like Sarah did. No, this was something professional. This felt like a ghost from my past assignment, following me home. I knew I couldn't touch the device yet. I needed to document it, and more importantly, I needed to figure out what that 3-pulse signal meant. I spent the rest of the night hunched over the computer, searching through old military manuals and counter-surveillance forums, trying to identify the specific frequency and pattern. I found nothing concrete, but I found enough to confirm my suspicions. The way the signal pulsed, the high frequency used, the brief transmission window. It was all designed to communicate something quickly without leaving a trace. The next day, I didn't tell Sarah, and I certainly didn't call the police. I called the one person I trusted who had the clearance and the technical knowledge to take this seriously, Sergeant Major Thompson. He was my CO overseas, and he was still working in intelligence back at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It took 3 hours to get him on the phone, and when I did, I kept the conversation clipped and cryptic. "Sir, this is Jake Riley. I need to run a piece of operational data by you. It involves a repetitive acoustic signature." "Riley." Thompson's voice was gravelly and tired over the phone. "You're supposed to be fly fishing right now. What are you talking about?" "It's an electronic pulse, sir. High frequency near ultrasound. 3 pulses repeating. 45-second transmission window. Always Yo2.37 local time." There was a long silence on Thompson's end. The kind of silence that confirms you haven't lost your mind. "Riley," he finally said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Did you say 3 pulses?" "Yes, sir. 3, then a gap, then 3 again, every night." "Where are you getting this signature?" "My property line, sir. It's coming from a small green device I located on an oak tree." Another long pause. I could hear him breathing heavily. "Riley, listen to me very carefully. Do not touch that device. Do not attempt to disable it. Do not let Ares near it. You understand?" "Yes, sir, but what is it?" "That signal, that specific 3-pulse pattern, is an old military identifier. It was used in one specific operation we ran last year, the one we were running when you and Ares were hit." My heart pounded. I remembered the ambush, the chaos, the flash of light, Ares pulling me clear just seconds before the secondary blast. It was a confirmation signal, Riley, a check-in. It meant the asset was in place and waiting for the next phase. "Waiting for the next phase of what, sir? We're home." That signal was linked to a particular cell we were tracking, the ones who were targeting our K9 handlers. They were using high-frequency triggers because they knew the dogs would react, but the humans wouldn't know why. It was designed to create chaos and doubt. I looked over at Ares, who was resting his head on my knee, watching me with worried intensity. He hadn't been hearing a ghost. He had been hearing the enemy. "Sir, if it's a check-in, then someone is receiving that signal. And if they're still checking in, it means they're still active. And if the device is on my property..." I trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "It means they haven't finished the job, Riley," Thompson finished grimly. "Or they're using your location to track someone else. Either way, you and Ares are exposed. I need you to stay calm. I'm going to send a team. They'll be there by tomorrow afternoon, discreetly. Until then, you are under observation. Assume you are being watched and act normal. Do not change your routine. Keep Ares inside. And do not, under any circumstances, let them know you've found their device." "Understood, sir." I hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the entire deployment crash back onto my shoulders. The quiet life was over. The war hadn't stayed overseas. It had followed Aries and me all the way back to suburban Ohio. I looked at the back door, then at the spectrum analyzer, which was now showing a flat line again. The green box was still out there, silent, waiting for the next 2:37 a.m. transmission. I looked down at Aries. He was my shield, my weapon, and now my only witness. He had been trying to tell me for weeks that we were still in the fight. "All right, buddy," I murmured, rubbing his ears. "We're back on patrol." But there was a problem. If Thompson was sending a team, they wouldn't arrive until the next afternoon. That meant I had to endure one more night of the signal, knowing exactly what it was and what it represented. And if they were tracking me, if they knew where I lived, they might not wait for the signal to finish. They might already be closing in. I spent the evening securing the house. I didn't turn on any extra lights. I pulled the blinds tight. I made sure my personal defense gear was easily accessible. I acted casual for Sarah when she called, talking about the weather and my plans to mow the lawn, but inside, I was coiled tight. I knew the danger was real now, and it was right outside my fence line, broadcasting its message into the dark. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait. Aries had confirmed the threat. I needed to understand the terrain. I grabbed the parabolic microphone and a pair of night vision goggles. I knew I couldn't risk leaving the house, but I could watch the area from the upstairs guest bedroom window, which offered a clear view of the oak tree and the drainage ditch. I checked the clock. 11 p.m. I had 3.5 hours until the next transmission. Aries came up the stairs with me, silently moving into the room. He didn't need to be told to be quiet. He knew the drill. I set up the parabolic mic, aiming it at the tree. Even though the audio recording wasn't picking up the high-frequency pulse, it would pick up anything else. A footstep, a car door, a whisper. I put on the night vision goggles. The world turned sickly green, but the visibility was excellent. I focused the lens on the oak tree. The little green box was a dark shadow against the pale bark. The hours crawled by. The house was utterly silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the digital clock on the dresser. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. Aries was sitting beside me, his gaze fixed on the window, waiting. At 2:30 a.m. I started recording on the laptop. My hands were sweating. I could feel the adrenaline dump starting. 2:35 a.m. I leaned in close to the parabolic mic headphones. All I heard was static and the distant sound of a semi-truck on the highway. 2:36 a.m. Aries tensed. His ears swiveled. He gave a soft, almost inaudible huff of acknowledgement. 2:37 a.m. The spectrum analyzer screen, sitting on the desk beside the laptop, registered the spike immediately. Pulse, pulse, pulse. And then Aries let out a sound I hadn't heard since we were under heavy fire, a sharp, choked yelp of pain, followed by a desperate, rapid series of low barks aimed directly at the window. He wasn't just reacting to the signal this time. He was reacting to something else. Something in the environment had changed. I ripped off the headphones, adrenaline surging. I pressed the night vision goggles tight against my face, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a shadow. It was a light. A single, tiny, red pinprick of light, flashing faintly near the oak tree, right beside the green box. It was almost gone immediately, but it was enough. It was a confirmation flash. Someone was nearby, responding to the signal. But then, the light appeared again, slightly higher up in the tree, and this time, it didn't flash. It stayed steady. I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't a handheld light, it was a lens. A camera lens, reflecting the moonlight, giving off that tiny red glow visible only through the night vision equipment. Someone wasn't just signaling from my property. They were watching me. And Aries' distress wasn't just about the familiar electronic pulse. It was about the presence of the person operating the camera, who had moved into position right as the signal began. The person was hidden in the upper branches of the oak tree, covered by the thick leaves, watching my house. The signal stopped. The red light vanished. The silence returned. Aries was still vibrating with tension, his eyes darting frantically, knowing the threat was still out there, suspended just above the ground, invisible in the dark. I slowly backed away from the window, pulling Aries with me. I didn't dare move too fast. I whispered into Aries' ear, "They're in the tree, buddy. They're up high." I retreated to the hallway, out of sight of the window. My mind was scrambling. I had until tomorrow afternoon for Thompson's team. I couldn't engage a sniper or observer in a tree. I didn't even know if they were armed, though I had to assume they were. I checked the clock. Ew again. 2:40 a.m. The threat was still there, waiting. I needed to secure the house and wait for dawn. But if they were watching me, they would see every move I made. I had to act like I hadn't seen them. I knew one thing for certain. The quiet life was definitely over. And Aries, my faithful, hyper-vigilant partner, had saved my life again, simply by refusing to ignore the sound that everyone else told me was nothing. But now, the threat was not just a sound. It was a pair of eyes, and they were fixed on my bedroom window. I crouched in the dark hallway, Aries pressed tightly against my side, and waited for the sun to rise. I didn't know what the next move was, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house until the cavalry arrived. I had to get Aries and myself out of the kill zone before the person in the tree decided the waiting phase was over. I looked at Aries, whose posture had softened, slightly, but who was still listening intently. He was ready for the next command. I had to figure out how to leave the house without the watcher in the oak tree knowing I was gone, and I had to do it before 2:37 a.m. tomorrow. The clock was ticking. The game was back on. The moment that red pinprick of light vanished, the air in the room didn't get quieter, it got heavier. It was a suffocating pressure, the kind you feel right before a mortar shell lands. I pulled Aries back, moving without sound, retreating into the shadow of the hallway. Aries was trembling, a silent earthquake of fear and rage, his eyes still fixed on the window, tracking a ghost I couldn't see. "Easy, boy. They know we're here," I breathed, my mouth dry. "But they don't know we know they're there." That was the only advantage I had left. The person in the tree, the observer, thought they were invisible. They thought I was a civilian veteran sleeping off my nightmares, unaware that my dog had been trying to scream the alarm for weeks. Thompson's team wasn't due until the afternoon. That meant 12 hours of sitting in a house where the enemy had a clear line of sight. That wasn't a patrol. That was a firing range. I checked the time, 2:40 a.m. The signal transmission was over, but the surveillance was active. I needed to get out, and I needed to do it, without the watcher knowing the house was empty. My training kicked in, taking over the panic. First rule of engagement: secure your asset. Aries was the asset. Second rule: control the information flow. I crawled back into the guest room on my belly, staying low beneath the windowsill. I looked at the laptop and the spectrum analyzer. They were my decoys. I grabbed my go bag, which I always kept packed, even in peacetime. Documents, cash, a TUES, trauma kit, and my sidearm, a Glock 19. If I had to fight my way out of Ohio, I'd be ready. Aries followed me into the master bedroom. I kept the lights off. I needed to create the illusion of a sleeping man. I pulled open the dresser and grabbed a few pillows and a heavy sleeping bag. I shaped the pillows under the duvet on the bed, creating a rough, man-shaped mound. It wouldn't fool a close inspection, but from 50 yards away through night vision, it would look like I was asleep. Next, the audio. If I left, the house would be too silent. I went back to the laptop in the guest room. I pulled up a long, looping ambient noise track, a very subtle, low-frequency white noise that masked the tiny sounds of the house settling. I set the volume just loud enough to be convincing, but not so loud that it would draw attention. I also left the laptop screen glowing, making it look like I'd fallen asleep while working. "Okay, partner," I whispered to Aries, who was watching my every move, his tail slightly down but his stance ready. "We're going low." The house was built on concrete piers with a 3-foot crawl space underneath. The access hatch was in the laundry room floor, tucked behind the washer and dryer. It was dusty, spider-infested, and perfect. I moved the appliances just enough to slide the square plywood hatch open. The air that wafted up was cool and smelled of damp earth and old insulation. Aries hesitated. He hated tight spaces, a trait he'd acquired after a nasty incident in a collapsed tunnel overseas. "Come on, Aries," I urged, tapping the floor. "Crawl space, quick and dirty. We need to go silent." He whined, a low, frustrated sound, but he didn't argue. He knew the tone of my voice meant business. He lowered his massive body and squeezed down into the hole, his fur brushing heavily against the wood frame. I followed, pulling the hatch closed above us. It clicked softly into place, plunging us into absolute darkness. I turned on the small tactical light on my wrist, setting it to the lowest red filter. Red light doesn't carry as far and helps preserve night vision. We were in a narrow, muddy tunnel of concrete and dirt. The air was thick. I had to move on my hands and knees, dragging the go bag. Behind me, Aries, being a big Malinois, had to belly crawl. His breathing was heavy, but he moved with disciplined silence, his nose low to the dirt. The plan was simple. Crawl the length of the house, exit the crawl space under the back porch, and use the natural cover of the terrain, the slight slope and the utility shed, to reach the drainage ditch bordering the property. Once we were in the ditch, we were out of the watcher's line of sight. Every scrape of my knee on the concrete felt like a thunderclap. Every shift of Aries's weight sounded like a landslide. I kept stopping, holding my breath, straining to hear anything above us. Was the watcher reacting? Was he moving? Aries kept moving forward, steady and low. He was sniffing the dirt, but he was also listening to the structure above us. He was navigating by sound and vibration. We finally reached the back corner near the foundation vent, where the crawl space opened up slightly under the small wooden deck that served as my back porch. I pushed the lattice panel aside just enough to slip out. The cold, wet grass hit my face. I was now directly under the watcher's line of sight, though still partially concealed by the deck. I slipped out first, pulling the lattice back into place. I lay flat on the ground, scanning the oak tree with the night vision goggles. The red light was gone. The watcher was completely obscured by the dense foliage, but I knew he was still there, a silent predator waiting for dawn. Aries, out, low and slow, I whispered. Aries squeezed out, shaking the dirt and cobwebs from his coat. He immediately dropped into a tactical crouch, his body radiating focus. We had about 40 feet of exposed lawn to cross to reach the utility shed, which offered the next piece of hard cover. I used the grass and the faint moonlight to guide me. I moved in a slow, controlled, low crawl, Aries mirroring my movements perfectly, staying tight against my left side. We reached the utility shed. It was a cheap aluminum structure, useless for defense but perfect for breaking the visual line. I pressed my back against the corrugated metal, catching my breath. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I had successfully evaded the watcher's immediate line of sight, but I was now standing 10 feet from the oak tree where the signaling device was taped, and where the watcher was perched. Aries suddenly stiffened, not the alert stance for the signal, but a slow, deliberate drop of his head, followed by a barely perceptible inhale. He was scenting. I froze. Was the watcher moving? Or had Aries picked up the scent of the man, carried by the slight breeze that drifted down from the tree? Aries gave a single, deep, silent vibration in his chest. A warning. It meant danger close. I didn't dare look up. If the watcher moved a branch, if he shifted his weight, I would hear it, but Aries would know it first. I waited, counting seconds that felt like minutes. 5, 10. Aries stayed frozen, his nose pointed toward the utility shed door. Not the tree, the shed door. I nudged Aries gently. "What is it?" He turned his head slightly and stared at the shed door, then back at the tree. It was like he was trying to solve a complicated geometry problem. The shed was where the watcher had been focused before the signal started. Maybe the observer had cached equipment there, or maybe... I realized Aries wasn't just smelling the watcher. He was smelling my scent, disturbed from when I was checking the perimeter yesterday afternoon. I had touched the shed. I had been active here. No, wait. Aries was too focused. This was fresh. I risked a look around the corner of the shed, toward the dark, overgrown drainage ditch. And that's when I saw it. Not near the tree, but about 20 feet down the ditch where the brush was thickest. A second figure. They were crouched low, completely motionless, dressed in dark tactical gear, using the shadows of the overgrown ditch as cover. They were facing the oak tree, the direction of the signal. My blood ran, cold. Thompson said the 3 pulse was a check-in, meaning the asset was in place and waiting for the next phase. I hadn't found one enemy. I had found 2. The person in the tree was the spotter / broadcaster. The person in the ditch was the receiving asset, the one waiting for the confirmation pulse to end. They weren't watching me specifically. They were coordinating an operation, and my house was the designated meeting point or target zone. Aries had smelled the second man. The scent was drifting right over the top of the drainage ditch toward the shed. I silently pulled the Glock from my bag, checking the action. I was trapped between the spotter above and the asset below. I needed to break contact immediately. I crept along the wall of the shed, moving away from the ditch, back toward the side of my property that bordered Mr. Henderson's yard. Henderson's house was dark, quiet, and thankfully, his fence was a tall, solid wood privacy barrier. I used the side of the shed as a shield, moving on my knees until I reached the fence. Aries was pressed so close to me, I could feel his heart pounding. I whispered into my phone, which was set to vibrate and minimal light. I had Thompson's secure number saved. "Sir, Riley, immediate update. I'm out of the house. I have 2 contacts. 1 observer in the oak tree, confirmed. Visual on a surveillance lens. 2nd asset in the drainage ditch, position confirmed. They are coordinating on the 3-pulse signal. They are active now." I waited, my ear pressed against the receiver, listening only to my own ragged breathing. Thompson answered immediately, his voice sharp and low. "Damn it, Riley, I told you to wait. Status of engagement?" "No engagement. I evaded visual contact via the crawlspace. I am currently between the ETG's utility shed and Henderson's fence line. I am exposed. The asset in the ditch is armed. I can see the outline of a rifle. They are waiting for something. Listen to me, Jake. Your house is a kill zone. You need to get off that property right now. Do not cross the drainage ditch. That's their line of attack. Move toward the front of the property, sticking to Henderson's fence line. Get to your vehicle, get Aries, and drive. Head east on 42 until you hit the rest stop. My team will intercept you there." "Understood, sir, but my vehicle is exposed in the driveway." "Then you walk, Riley. You walk until you are out of the immediate area. Do you have Aries?" "Aries is with me." "Good. Use him for perimeter security. Go now." I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Walking was going to take longer, but it was safer than trying to start the truck in the driveway, which would immediately alert the watcher in the tree. I had to move 50 yards along the fence line, staying low until I reached the front yard, then slip away down the street. I looked at Aries. He was ready. "Fence line, buddy. Low and slow," I instructed, using hand signals he recognized instantly. We started moving. The wood fence was rough against my back, providing a false sense of security. I moved in a low crouch, taking measured steps. The silence was the killer. In the desert, silence meant something was already dead. Here, it meant the enemy was waiting. We passed the corner of the house. Now we were moving along the side toward the street. Every window was a potential line of fire. Aries suddenly stopped, ears swiveling toward the house. Not the tree. The house. He gave a low, questioning sniff, then let out a tiny, high-pitched purrt sound, like static coming from a speaker. I froze, scanning the house wall. "What is it, Aries?" He pointed his nose toward the main power meter, which was mounted on the side of the house about 10 feet away. It was nothing but a standard gray box with a glass dial. But Aries was locked onto it. He started whining, a nervous, high-frequency sound he only made when he detected a specific type of electrical signature. I knew that sound. That was the sound he made when he detected a power source for a large device. I crept closer, using the faint light filtering from the street lamp. The meter looked normal. I risked shining my red light on the meter box. The glass dial was spinning rapidly, far too fast for a house that was only running a refrigerator and a few clocks. Someone was drawing a massive amount of power, but from where? I looked back at the utility shed, then at the oak tree. The green signaling device was small, battery-powered. It wouldn't draw this kind of current. The current had to be powering something inside the house or something directly connected to the power grid. I risked a quick, close inspection of the meter box. I noticed a thin, almost invisible wire running from the bottom of the meter down the concrete foundation and disappearing into the dirt near the foundation vents. They weren't just observing me. They had tapped into my power line. I backed away, adrenaline screaming through my veins. This wasn't a simple surveillance operation. This was preparation for a major event. Why tap the power? To charge something large? To power a massive jammer? Or worse, to power a detonator for something they planned to install inside? If I didn't get out now, I was going to be caught in the middle of whatever they were setting up. I turned back toward the front yard, urgency overriding caution. We had to move, faster. We reached the front corner of the house. The street was quiet. Mr. Henderson's lawn was dark. The truck was sitting innocently in the driveway. "Stay low," I muttered, moving across the front lawn, using the cover of the low bushes near the porch. We reached the edge of the driveway. I had to cross 10 feet of open concrete to reach the curb and the sidewalk. Aries stopped dead. He didn't whine or growl. He just put his body in front of mine, facing the street. I looked up. Nothing. Just the yellow glow of the street lamp and the empty road. I pulled out the night vision goggles again, scanning the street. Empty. Except about 100 yards down the road, parked under the heavy shadow of a large maple tree, was a dark-colored sedan. No lights on, engine off. It looked like any other car, except it was parked oddly, slightly angled toward my house. It hadn't been there when I went inside last night. Aries had picked up on the residual heat of the engine, or perhaps the faint, high-frequency sound of a listening device running inside the vehicle. The trap was closing. I had a spotter in the back, an armed asset in the ditch, and now a surveillance vehicle blocking the exit on the street. Driving was impossible. They'd see me get in the truck, and I'd be boxed in. "New plan, Aries. We go long," I whispered. We abandoned the idea of the truck. We needed to use the suburban sprawl as cover. We slipped across the driveway, staying low, and crossed the street, moving quickly but silently onto Mr. Henderson's property across the road. Aries moved like a shadow, hugging the line of the hedges. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark sedan. If anyone moved inside that car, I'd know it. We skirted Henderson's lawn, moving toward the backyard fence. We were putting distance between us and the kill zone. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. Not from the street, but from my house. The sound of shattering glass. It was loud, sharp, and unmistakable. Someone had just broken a window. The person in the oak tree must have realized I was gone, or perhaps the asset in the ditch had moved in. The operation had just gone hot. I dropped to a knee behind a thick row of rhododendrons, pulling Aries down with me. The sedan down. The street flashed its headlights once, quickly, then shut them off. A signal. They had confirmed the breach. The observer in the tree, the asset in the ditch, and the vehicle on the street, they were all communicating. "Thompson!" I hissed into the phone, dialing him again, keeping my voice low. "They're inside the house. I heard glass. They know I'm gone. I'm moving off the grid now. We're on Henderson's property across the street." Thompson didn't waste time. "Riley, you are now considered compromised. They will be sweeping the area. You need to blend. Get into the suburban environment. Do not stop until you are at the intercept point." "Understood." I hung up. I looked at Aries. He was alert, but strangely calmer now that the threat was audible and visible. The silent signal was terrifying. The sound of broken glass was a simple declaration of war he understood. We moved quickly, through Henderson's backyard, then cut through the next 2 yards, vaulting low fences, moving parallel to the main road but staying deep in the residential maze. My paranoia was now justified. I wasn't running from a phantom. I was running from a coordinated team. As we reached the 5th house down, Aries stopped and pointed his nose toward the sky. I looked up. The sky was still black, but I could hear a distant, faint sound. A helicopter. It wasn't a police chopper. It was too quiet, too high, and the rhythm of the blades was wrong. It sounded like a military-grade observation platform. They weren't just using ground surveillance. They had aerial backup. "We need cover, Aries," I said urgently. I spotted a large, dark structure at the back of the next property. A detached 3-car garage far away from the main house. It was perfect. We slipped into the shadow of the garage. I checked the doors. Locked. But there was a small, high window near the roofline, usually left slightly ajar for ventilation. I boosted Aries up. He was trained to climb. He got his front paws on the sill, leveraged his weight, and silently slipped inside. A moment later, I heard a soft click. Aries had found the interior lock and opened the side door. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me. The air was dusty and smelled of gasoline and old tires. I was standing in the middle of someone else's garage, hiding from a military-grade surveillance team that had tracked me from overseas. I checked the time, 3:15 a.m. We had made good distance, but we were still in the immediate area. I looked through the small, dirty window. I could see the helicopter now, a dark shape circling slowly, maybe a mile away, but definitely moving toward my neighborhood. I sat down on an old workbench, catching my breath. Aries lay down instantly, but his head remained up, listening to the sounds of the night. I pulled out my phone. I needed to know what Thompson was doing. "Sir, they have air support. Confirmed light observation helicopter. They're sweeping the neighborhood." "I see it on the radar, Riley. We're moving up the timeline. My team is 2 hours out. You need to stay put and stay silent. If they find you, do not engage. Wait for the cavalry." "Understood, sir, about the power meter. They tapped the line. They're drawing heavy current." Thompson was silent for a moment. "That's not surveillance, Riley. That's a preparation stage. They're setting up something big. We're running facial recognition on the known cell members. Stay hidden. I'll call you back with the intercept coordinates." I put the phone away. I had 2 hours until Thompson's team arrived. 2 hours to hide from a coordinated search that included ground assets and air support. I looked around the garage. It was cluttered, filled with boxes, lawnmowers, and tools. Perfect hiding spot. Aries suddenly nudged my hand, then shifted his gaze toward a stack of old cardboard boxes in the back corner near the wall shared with the neighbor's property. He gave that low, focused growl, the detection growl. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered. He didn't move his eyes from the box stack. I crept over, slowly pushing aside a heavy bag of gardening soil. Behind the boxes, taped to the concrete wall, was another device. It was smaller than the green box on my oak tree, maybe the size of a cigarette pack, painted black. It had a tiny, pulsing blue LED light that was barely visible. I recognized the shape instantly. It was a local relay, a signal booster. The person in the oak tree had broadcast the 3-pulse signal. The asset in the ditch had received it, and this device, placed in the neighbor's garage, was amplifying the signal or acting as a repeater to send the confirmation back to the dark sedan, or maybe even to the helicopter. My house wasn't the target. It was the hub, the center of a command and control network. I backed away slowly. If I touched that relay, I risked alerting the entire network. Ares lay down beside me, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never leaving the device. He was guarding the relay, ensuring it didn't activate or detect our presence. I realized the chilling genius of the enemy's tactic. They weren't using loud bombs or obvious traps. They were using high-frequency, silent communication systems, betting that the only thing that could detect them, a military K-9, would be dismissed as a psychological casualty. They were using Ares's unique sensory ability against us, turning his warnings into my perceived paranoia. But they had underestimated the bond. They had underestimated our training. I had to wait for Thompson, but I couldn't just sit there. I knew the network was using my neighborhood as its staging area. If I could map the network, I could disrupt their operation before Thompson even arrived. I looked at the blue LED on the relay box. It was pulsing steadily, silently. It was still active. I pulled out a small notepad and pen from my go bag. I started drawing a map of the neighborhood, marking the location of my house, the oak tree, the drainage ditch, the dark sedan, and now the relay in the garage. I needed to find the third point of the triangle, the central receiving station that was coordinating the whole attack. If they were using my neighborhood as a hub, they had to have a base of operations nearby. Someone had to be operating that helicopter and receiving the consolidated data. I looked at the clock again. 3:30 a.m. 90 minutes until extraction. I realized I had a window. The ground team was inside my house thinking I was still there, or maybe searching the immediate perimeter. The air support was circling wide. The sedan was parked, waiting. If I moved now, using the cover of the backyards, I might be able to find the central node. I looked at Ares. He was tense, but ready. "We're going scouting, buddy," I whispered. "We're going to find the headquarters." I slipped out of the garage back into the shadows of the suburban night, Ares moving right behind me. We moved like ghosts, using the fences, the sheds, and the darkness as our armor. We moved 2 blocks north, toward the main arterial road. This was a higher-density area with small businesses and apartment complexes. If they needed a temporary HQ, this was where they would hide. As we crossed an alleyway behind a row of dental offices and dry cleaners, Ares suddenly slammed on the brakes. He didn't growl. He froze, his body rigid, staring down the alley. I stopped, pulling out the night vision goggles. At the far end of the alley, near the dumpster, I saw a familiar glint of metal. It was the dark sedan, the same one that had been parked outside my house. It had moved, repositioning itself to watch the main road, but also to cover this alleyway. And beside the dumpster, I saw movement. 2 men, dark figures talking low into handheld radios. They were checking the perimeter, maintaining security. I realized Ares hadn't stopped because of the men. He had stopped because of a sound I couldn't hear. I strained my ears. Nothing but the low hum of refrigeration units. Ares slowly shifted his attention away from the men and focused on the building right beside the dumpster, a nondescript 2-story building labeled Storage Solutions. He let out a single, sharp, low-frequency bark, the sound he used to confirm a deep, structural anomaly. I looked at the building. It was completely dark, windows tinted, heavy steel doors. But Aries was telling me that inside that building, something was generating the kind of energy or sound signature that only he could perceive. I pulled out the spectrum analyzer I had brought in my bag. I turned it on, holding it low to the ground. The screen immediately flared to life. Not the high-frequency triple pulse from the oak tree, but a constant, massive energy spike across the low to mid-range. It was a continuous broadcast, far more powerful than any commercial radio signal. That building wasn't storing old furniture. It was the command and control hub. I looked at Aries, whose ears were pressed flat against his head, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the noise coming from the building. "That's it, partner," I whispered, feeling a surge of cold clarity. "That's their nerve center." I needed to get closer. I needed proof. And more than that, I needed to know what they were planning to do with all that tapped power in the coordination network. I looked at the two guards by the dumpster, then back at the storage building. The side of the building facing the alley had a small, recessed service door, likely used for maintenance. We crept forward, using the dumpsters as cover, closing the distance to the service door. The two guards were focused on the main road and the sedan. Aries moved with absolute precision, his paws finding the softest patches of asphalt. We reached the door. It was steel, thick, and locked with a heavy padlock. I examined the door frame. There were tiny, almost invisible scratch marks around the lock, fresh marks. They were using this door. I pulled out a small specialized toolkit I carried, lockpicks, not usually for military ops, but necessary for covert entry. I told Aries to stay back, covering me. I knelt down, my heart hammering against my ribs, and started working the lock. It was a standard commercial lock. It took me 30 seconds, but the tumblers finally clicked. I slowly eased the heavy door open, just an inch. The smell that hit me wasn't dust or storage. It was the clean, dry air of high-end electronics, mixed with the faint metallic scent of ozone. I slipped inside, Aries right behind me, pulling the door closed silently. The inside of the storage unit was vast and cold. It wasn't filled with junk. It was filled with rows of server racks glowing with hundreds of tiny status lights. Wires snaked everywhere. It looked like a temporary data center. And right in the middle of the room, standing beside a large, custom-built console, was a man. He was focused on the screens, talking softly into a headset. He was wearing civilian clothes, but his posture was military, tight and professional. I raised the Glock ready to engage, but Aries stopped me with a low, intense pressure on my leg. He was right. Engaging now would alert the two men outside and bring down the helicopter. I needed intelligence, not a shootout. I crept closer, using the large, dark shapes of the server racks for cover. The man was speaking English, but with a slight, unplaceable accent, a blend of European and Middle Eastern cadence. "The asset is moving to Phase 2, he said into the headset. "The target is confirmed vacated. We are initiating the main power draw now. Prepare the final dispersal. Sequence. Phase 2. Dispersal sequence." I risked peeking around the rack. The console he was looking at had a schematic of my neighborhood on the screen. My house was highlighted in red, and then I saw the timer. A large digital countdown ticking down rapidly. It read 8:00:47.12. Less than an hour until the final sequence, and next to the timer there was a schematic of the power grid, showing the massive current being drawn from my tapped power meter. This power was feeding the entire console and the dispersal system. "What is the dispersal sequence?" Thompson's voice echoed in my head. I watched the man type something into the console. The map on the screen changed. It showed a series of small geometric icons overlaid on the residential streets surrounding my house. The icons looked like small explosive charges. My house wasn't the target. My house was the trigger. They had tapped the power to charge a network of small, dispersed devices across the neighborhood. I finally understood the triple pulse Aries had been hearing. It wasn't just a check-in. It was the final synchronization signal, the signal that confirmed the network was armed and ready, and in 47 minutes they were going to detonate something that would cause massive chaos and destruction right here in suburban Ohio, and they were going to frame the retired military K-9 handler who had just snapped and blown up his own neighborhood. Ares saved my life by hearing the signal. Now, he and I had to stop the detonation. I pulled out my phone and quietly took 3 rapid photos of the console screen, the timer, and the map. Proof. Then I looked at the man at the console. He was the key. I didn't have time to wait for Thompson. I had to go loud. I took a deep breath, and Ares, sensing the shift in my intention, rose silently to his full height, his gaze fixed on the enemy. "Ares," I whispered, using the command word for silent attack. "Take him." The war was finally here. The silent signal had led us straight to the heart of the operation, and now it was time to end it. I just hoped 47 minutes was enough time to dismantle a bomb network and get out alive. Ares didn't hesitate. When I gave the silent command, his body, which had been 100 pounds of coiled tension, exploded into motion. It wasn't a bark or a charge, it was pure, disciplined acceleration. The man at the console, focused entirely on his ticking screen, never saw him coming. Ares hit him low, not with teeth, but with a massive 90-pound shoulder slam aimed right at the man's center of gravity. The impact was sickeningly solid, a heavy thud that echoed once in the open, sterile space of the storage room. The man went down hard, the headset flying off, scattering across the slick concrete floor. He gasped, more surprised than hurt, struggling immediately to regain control. I was on him in a flash, the Glock pressed against the side of his neck. "Don't move," I spat, my voice tight with adrenaline. "Don't touch anything." Ares was already positioned, his weight settling heavily on the man's chest, his low growl vibrating through the floor. The operator, clearly trained but startled, immediately recognized the posture of a military working dog and went limp. Smart move. I didn't waste a second. I reached into my go bag and pulled out 2 heavy-duty zip ties. I secured his wrists behind his back, pulling them tight. "What did you trigger?" I demanded, kicking the headset away. "What is the dispersal sequence?" The man gritted his teeth, his eyes wide with fear and anger. "Go. To hell, veteran." I pressed the barrel harder against his temple. 47 minutes. That's how long until you blow up a neighborhood full of families. Tell me how to stop it, or I swear to God, I will let Ares decide. Ares gave a low, rumbling cough, a sound that meant he was ready to switch from restraint to engagement. The man's resolve cracked. "It's automated. I can't stop it from here. You were talking about Phase 2. What is Phase 2? It's the final sync. The charges are armed. Phase 2 means we vacate the CNC hub and wait for the detonation. The power tap is just to ensure the burst transmission is strong enough to trigger the entire network simultaneously." I glanced back at the console. The timer was still ticking down. 0.4550. I grabbed the hard drive and the main communications radio from the console desk. I needed the data and the comms. But as I reached for the central power switch, the man yelled, "Don't touch that. You'll trigger the override." Too late. My hand brushed a large red, unmarked button under the console. I hadn't even meant to hit it. A loud, piercing alarm immediately began screaming from the console. Not the silent kind. This was a full-volume, piercing klaxon designed to alert everyone within a quarter mile. The timer on the screen, which had been counting down in measured seconds, suddenly flashed red, accelerated, and dropped dramatically. 0015 HU. "What did you do?" I roared, spinning back to the operator. "The silent alarm," he gasped, panic in his eyes. "It accelerates the sequence if the hub is compromised. It assumes you'll try to shut down the power. It gives us 15 minutes to escape." 15 minutes, not 45. 15 minutes until every house in my neighborhood, including Sarah's, was turned. into shrapnel, and the alarm was screaming loud enough to bring the 2 guards outside running. I grabbed the operator by the collar and dragged him behind a massive server rack. "Ares, cover the door. We go loud now." Ares moved instantly, positioning himself near the service door, low and ready. I pulled out my phone and dialed Thompson, adrenaline making my hands shake. "Sir, the hub is compromised. Timer accelerated to 15 minutes. Repeat, 15 minutes. They're using a tapped power line to trigger a network of dispersed acoustic charges across the residential area. It's designed to look like a terrorist attack by a disgruntled veteran. I have the operator subdued, but the alarm is active. Guards are inbound." Thompson's voice was instantly calm, cutting through the alarm. "Jake, listen. If they're acoustic charges, they need a specific frequency to detonate. They'll also need a specific frequency to disarm. Did you get the console?" "I have the hard drive and the comms radio, but I can't access the data here. Get out. Get that hard drive to my team. The intercept is now 90 minutes too late. You need to find a way to broadcast a cancellation frequency. Find the highest point you can." A heavy, metallic thump hit the steel service door. The guards were here. "They're on the door, Thompson. I'm breaking. Contact. Go, Jake, and for God's sake, keep Ares safe." I hung up, shoving the hard drive and the radio deep into my go bag. I grabbed a heavy 3-foot metal bar from the workbench, a makeshift weapon. "Ares, move. Back door." We slipped out the way we came in, pulling the service door shut behind us, leaving the screaming alarm and the zip-tied operator behind the server racks. The 2 guards outside were still focused on the main, heavy, front entrance of the storage unit, assuming the attacker was still inside. They were kicking the door, yelling in rapid, accented English. We were in the alleyway, just 10 feet from the dark sedan they had been using for surveillance. I saw my chance. I couldn't risk them pursuing me on foot. I needed wheels, and I needed the equipment inside that sedan. "Ares, sedan, go!" Ares understood the nonverbal command. He didn't bark. He was a silent missile aimed at the back of the sedan. I moved toward the nearest guard, the metal bar held low. The first guard finally looked over his shoulder, hearing the faint clack of Ares's claws on the asphalt. He spun, raising his rifle. Ares was faster. He slammed into the guard's legs, tackling him backward into the dumpster with a tremendous crash of metal and garbage. The rifle clattered onto the concrete, useless. The second guard reacted, instantly, dropping his radio and pivoting toward me, pulling a pistol from his holster. I didn't give him time to aim. I lunged, swinging the metal bar low and hard. It connected with his wrist, a bone-jarring impact that made him cry out. The pistol went flying into the darkness. I followed up with a shoulder tackle, driving him into the brick wall of the storage unit. He slumped, winded. Ares had the first guard completely pinned, a low, menacing snarl finally escaping his throat. I didn't look at the defeated men. I focused on the sedan. I smashed the driver's side window with the metal bar, a controlled, loud sound, but necessary. I reached inside, popped the lock, and slid into the driver's seat. Ares immediately jumped into the back, taking up position, scanning the alley. The car was a late-model, high-performance sedan, perfect for surveillance and quick escape. I hot-wired it in seconds, a skill I learned overseas that I hoped I'd never have to use back home. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful sound that shattered the suburban silence. I didn't wait. I threw the sedan into reverse, spinning the wheels, and then slammed it into drive, barreling out of the alleyway onto the main road. I glanced at the dashboard. A small digital clock on the center console was synchronized with the hub. 0, 14, 15. 15 minutes, Ares, I muttered, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. We're in a race against the clock. I sped down the main road, ignoring the speed limit, trying to put as much distance between us and the CNC hub as possible, while also heading toward the intercept point Thompson had previously mentioned, east on 42 toward the rest stop. But 14 minutes wasn't enough time to reach the highway, much less the rest stop. I needed to find a solution, now. I pulled the captured communications radio out of my bag. It was a sophisticated military-grade transceiver far beyond anything commercial. I needed to send a signal, but I didn't know the disarm code or the exact frequency needed to override the acoustic charges. "We need the hard drive, Ares," I said, glancing in the rearview mirror. I slammed the brakes, pulling the sedan into the empty parking lot of a closed gas station about a mile from the CNC hub. I left the engine running, ready for a quick getaway. I ripped the hard drive out of the bag and plugged it into my ruggedized laptop, which I'd also grabbed. I had a few decryption programs, but this was specialized military data. It wouldn't be easy. The timer was at 0:12:30. I worked frantically, typing in every default military password and encryption key I knew. Nothing worked. The drive was locked, down tight. Ares was sitting beside me, his ears twitching, listening to the night. Come on, I pleaded with the machine. Then I heard the sound I dreaded, the faint thump, thump, thump of the helicopter blades, closer now, definitely heading in my direction. They were sweeping the area, looking for the vehicle that broke the silence. I had to move. I couldn't risk being caught stationary. I threw the car back into drive, tearing out of the gas station parking lot. As I drove, I kept working the laptop, trying a last-ditch brute force attack on the hard drive encryption. Diodoro to 10:45. Thompson, I'm mobile, I hissed into the captured radio, hoping he was monitoring the frequency. I can't crack the hard drive. I need the disarm code or the frequency now. I have 10 minutes. Silence. The frequency was probably jammed, or Thompson was too far away to respond immediately. I looked at the map I had drawn on my notepad. The explosive charges were spread across the entire residential grid. Hundreds of them, small, designed to cause widespread panic and structural damage. Not necessarily massive craters. They were timed to go off simultaneously. How could I stop a synchronized detonation network without the disarm code? I thought back to the green box on my oak tree. The triple pulse. Ares had been reacting to that synchronization signal. The charges were acoustic. They were designed to detonate when they received a specific sound wave. That high-frequency triple pulse. If I couldn't send the disarm code, maybe I could overwhelm the system. Overload the acoustic triggers with massive, continuous noise. But it had to be on the right frequency. The high-frequency range that Ares was so sensitive to. I needed a massive amplifier and a frequency generator. I had the generator. My spectrum analyzer could produce tones, but I didn't have the power to broadcast it across the neighborhood. Then I looked at the powerful comms radio I had stolen from the hub. It was designed for long-range, high-power transmission. It was built to broadcast that triple pulse across miles. If I could jury-rig the spectrum analyzer to feed a continuous, disrupting signal into the high-power transmitter, I might be able to fry the acoustic triggers before the timer hit 0. But I needed to be high up, and I needed to do it quickly. I looked around. I was driving through the business district now. Everything was low-rise. Then I saw it. 2 blocks ahead, dominating the skyline. The old water tower. It was decommissioned, but it stood 80 feet tall, the highest point in this part of town. I swung the sedan hard, tires squealing, heading toward the tower access road. U0, 50. Ares, we're climbing, I said, putting my foot down. I found the chain-link fence surrounding the tower. It was secured with a heavy lock. I slammed the sedan into the fence, tearing the chain link right off the concrete post. I drove the car through the gap and parked it directly beneath the tower's ladder. I grabbed the spectrum analyzer, the comms radio, and a coil of cable from the sedan's trunk. Standard military comms cable eye, found under the spare tire. These guys were prepared for anything. Stay, Ares. Guard the base, I commanded. Ares whined, looking up at the steep metal ladder. He wanted to climb with me, but I needed him to protect the equipment and keep watch for the helicopter, which was getting dangerously close. I started climbing. The metal was icy cold and wet with dew. I moved fast, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs, far faster than the ticking clock in the car below. I reached the circular platform at the top. The wind howled, and the whole structure swayed slightly. I set down the equipment. The clock was at 06:15. I had to connect the spectrum analyzer's tone generator output to the comms radio's high-power antenna input. This was a massive hack. I risked blowing up both devices, but I had no choice. I stripped the comms cable with my knife, exposing the copper wires. My hands were shaking violently, not just from the cold, but from the realization that the lives of everyone I knew depended on me connecting 3 tiny wires correctly in under 6 minutes. I found the output port on the spectrum analyzer. I spliced the first wire, ground, the second wire, signal. I wrapped it tight around the pin, securing it with electrical tape I pulled from my go bag. Euro 40. I heard the sound of the helicopter distinctly now. It was directly overhead, circling the area, its searchlight sweeping the ground. The light hit the water tower. I flattened myself against the metal platform, trying to become one with the rust. The helicopter hovered, the deafening thump, thump, thump of the blades shaking the tower. They had spotted the smashed fence and the stolen sedan. They knew I was here. I had 30 seconds before they realized I was on the platform. I needed the final wire, the power source for the broadcast. I jammed the wire into the radio's power port. Sparks flew, stinging my fingers. The radio display immediately went dark, then rebooted, humming angrily. It was working. The connection was live, but unstable. Euro 3 Guas. The helicopter pilot saw me. The searchlight locked on, blinding me. I ignored it. I flipped the comms radio to maximum power output, ignoring the warnings flashing on its tiny screen. Now, the frequency. I had to generate a continuous, overpowering acoustic signal on the exact frequency that Ares had been hearing. The frequency the charges were designed to respond to. I remembered what Thompson had said. Ares was hearing something near the high end of the acoustic range, bordering on ultrasound. I slammed the frequency generator on the spectrum analyzer up to 22 kHz, just past the limit of human hearing, but perfectly within Ares's range. I switched the analyzer from monitor to generate, and then cranked the tone to maximum volume. The comms radio immediately began to whine. Not the rhythmic triple pulse, but a continuous, high-pitched, agonizing shriek of pure ultrasonic energy, broadcasting across the entire neighborhood. I couldn't hear the shriek itself, but I felt it, a vibrating pressure inside my skull, a dizzying, sickening force that made my vision swim. 00:02:15. The helicopter immediately broke off its hover, pulling away sharply. The ultrasonic blast must have hit the sensitive microphones and communication systems on board. It was scattering them. But the real test was on the ground. I gripped the platform railing, fighting the nausea caused by the intense pressure wave I was broadcasting. I looked down. Ares was still at the base of the tower, but he was writhing. He was covering his ears, with his paws, whimpering, trying desperately to escape the frequency that was attacking his system. My heart shattered. I was using the very thing that protected us, his hypersensitive hearing, to save everyone else. I was torturing my partner. "Hold on, Ares, I'm sorry. Hold on, buddy," I yelled into the wind, knowing he couldn't hear me over the psychic pressure of the broadcast. I had to maintain the signal until the timer hit 0, or until I was sure the acoustic triggers were fried. 00:01 Sers. I kept my finger pressed on the generator button, feeling the raw, unstable power flowing through the makeshift connection. The radio started smoking. The plastic casing warped under the heat of the massive power draw. I watched the clock tick down. Every second was an eternity. I was waiting for the sound of explosions, the confirmation that I had failed. 0 Shigun 30. I closed my eyes, picturing the map on the console, the little explosive icons scattered across the streets. If I failed, Thompson would arrive to find a disaster zone, and the enemy would have successfully destabilized a major American city, all pinned on a crazy veteran. 0 Stru 10. I felt a surge of energy through the radio, a final massive blast of power that made the antenna sizzle. 0 Go Do 5. 0 4. Go Do 3. Go 2. Gas. The timer hit 0. Silence. The radio connection blew out completely. The smoke intensified and the spectrum analyzer screen went dark. The ultrasonic shriek stopped instantly. I was left with the sound of the wind, the distant thump of the retreating helicopter, and my own ragged breathing. I strained my ears, listening for the sound of explosions, of glass shattering, of sirens. Nothing. Complete, absolute silence. I had done it. I had overridden the acoustic triggers, overloading the small, sensitive devices before the detonation sequence could finalize. I looked down at Ares. As soon as the sound stopped, he stopped writhing. He shook his head violently, disoriented, but then he looked up at me, his eyes searching. "It's over, buddy," I whispered, relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. "It's over." I started the long, shaky climb down the ladder, carrying the now useless melted equipment. When I reached the ground, Ares stumbled toward me, sniffing me frantically, checking for injury. He gave a low, relieved moan, and then pressed his heavy head against my chest. I know, I murmured, burying my face in his fur. "I'm sorry, partner. That was a rough one." We had saved the neighborhood, but we weren't safe yet. The enemy knew exactly where we were. I guided Ares back into the stolen sedan. I needed to move, and I needed to rendezvous with Thompson's team, who were now less than an hour away. I started the car and drove east on 42, finally heading toward the original intercept point. I called Thompson on my secure phone, keeping the captured radio silent. "Sir, Riley, the sequence was neutralized. I used the captured comms to broadcast a continuous overpowering acoustic wave at 22 kHz. I believe the charges are disarmed or rendered inert." A beat of silence, then Thompson's, relieved but still professional voice. "God almighty, Riley, you just saved an entire sector. Good job. Now listen, the facial recognition hit on your hub operator. He's tied to a known cell we thought we neutralized months ago. They're highly specialized in psychological warfare and deniable attacks. They were trying to frame me, sir." "Exactly. Now, about the air support, they're still sweeping. You need to ditch the sedan and move off the road. They'll be tracking that vehicle." "Understood. Where's the new intercept?" "I'm sending you the coordinates now. It's a truck stop on I-70, about 30 miles east. It's crowded, good for blending. Get there and don't stop." I looked at the fuel gauge, almost empty. I needed gas, fast. I pulled into a busy, brightly lit truck stop on the outskirts of Springfield. I parked the black sedan far away from the main entrance, grabbing the hard drive and my go bag. "Ares, stay close. We're getting fuel, then we're gone." I slipped Ares's harness back on. He was walking stiffly, still shaking off the ultrasonic assault, but he was alert. We walked into the brightly lit convenience store. The clash of the normal world, the smell of coffee, the sound of the slushy machine, with the chaos we had just survived was dizzying. I paid for a tank of gas in cash, trying to look like a normal, exhausted guy on a road trip. Ares sat patiently by the door, watching everyone who entered. As I was walking out, a man in a clean, dark uniform, a state trooper, walked in, nodding politely as he passed me. I kept walking, heart rate spiking. I knew the police would be looking for the stolen black sedan and the veteran who had just caused a massive disturbance. I made it back to the car, quickly pumping the gas. Ares suddenly gave a soft, urgent nudge to my hand. He looked past the truck stop toward the dark, forested area behind the building. He wasn't looking at the woods. He was looking at a dark, unmarked cargo van parked innocently near the edge of the lot. His ears twitched and he gave that familiar, low, pert sound, the sound of an electrical anomaly. I froze, pump handle in my hand. This wasn't local police. This felt like the continuation of the team. I glanced at the van. Tinted windows. Nothing visible inside. I finished filling the tank, trying to act casual. I capped the tank and got back into the sedan. "We're leaving now, Aries." I put the car in drive, slowly pulling out of the spot, heading toward the exit. As I passed the dark cargo van, the side door slid open silently. A man was sitting inside, wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, silver, parabolic dish, the kind used for directional acoustic listening. He was pointing it directly at the black sedan. He hadn't been monitoring the comms. He had been listening to the residual ultrasonic signature on Aries. And then I saw the man smile. A cold, knowing smile that told me he knew exactly who I was and what I had done. He didn't fire. He didn't move to intercept. He just raised his hand and gave me a slow, mocking wave. Then he leaned forward and spoke into a small microphone clipped to his jacket. A second later, the radio on my seat, the captured comms unit, crackled to life, despite being technically inert. A voice, synthesized and flat, spoke clearly through the static. "You stopped the first wave, Riley. Impressive, but the dog is still broadcasting. We'll see you soon." The radio went silent again. They hadn't just been using Aries' sensitivity against me. They had planted a tracker or a beacon on him, using the ultrasonic frequency he was so attuned to. I floored the gas pedal, tearing out of the truck stop, Aries pressed against the seat beside me. The war wasn't over. The silent signal hadn't stopped. It was coming from my own partner, and the enemy was listening. We had successfully disrupted their plan, but now, Aries himself was the target, and the beacon leading them straight to us. I had to get to Thompson's team, and I had to figure out how to silence the most sensitive thing I owned before the enemy decided to retrieve their walking, barking surveillance asset. The fate of Aries, and maybe the next phase of the enemy's plan, depended on it. We were heading east on 42, but the silent signal was following us. The next phase was personal. We were flying down I-70 east, the stolen black sedan eating up the miles, but my mind was stuck back at that truck. Stop. Watching that guy in the cargo van smile. "The dog is still broadcasting. We'll see you soon." That sentence hit me harder than any IED ever did. It wasn't just a threat. It was a revelation. They weren't just using the environment to track us. They were using Aries himself. They had turned my partner, my protector, into a walking, barking homing beacon. I looked in the rearview mirror. Aries was sitting up, his big amber eyes watching the dark highway blur past. He was still shaking slightly, maybe from the adrenaline, maybe from the ultrasonic blast I'd just hit him with. "We gotta fix this, pal," I muttered, rubbing the back of his neck with my free hand. "We gotta find whatever they put on you." I drove for another 10 minutes, just trying to put distance between us and the van, which I knew was probably already back on the road, closing the gap. I had to assume that van wasn't the only asset they had on the road. I pulled over hard under a massive concrete overpass, the kind that cuts out all satellite and radio signals. It was pitch black and relatively safe from immediate visual surveillance, at least for a minute. "Stay," I ordered Aries, putting the car in park. I ripped off Aries' tactical harness. It was heavy, made of thick black nylon, designed to hold his Kevlar plate and his comms gear overseas. I had never taken it off him since we got back, except for baths. It felt wrong, like stripping a soldier of his uniform. I pulled out the spectrum analyzer. The device was fragile now, slightly melted and smoking faintly from the massive power surge, but it still worked. I switched it to the high-frequency acoustic monitoring mode. I held the small sensor wand close to Ares's body. Nothing registered. He was clean. Then I moved the wand over the harness. The analyzer immediately lit up like a Christmas tree, displaying a continuous high-intensity spike right at 23 kHz, just slightly higher than the 22 kHz I had broadcast to disarm the bombs. The source wasn't Ares's body, it was the harness. I spread the thick nylon harness out on the passenger seat. The spike was coming from a specific area near the shoulder strap, where the stitching was particularly dense. I grabbed my tactical knife, the kind with a serrated edge, and started carefully cutting through the heavy nylon webbing. I had to be precise. If I damaged the transmitter, it might switch to a different frequency, or worse, trigger a tamper response. Ares watched me, nervous but still. He knew this was important. I cut through 3 layers of webbing, and there it was. Not a wire, not a battery, but a tiny dark gray chip, maybe the size of a thumbnail, completely sealed in a thin layer of resin. It was glued directly to the inside of the harness structure. It was so small, so flat, it felt like part of the fabric. It was professional. It was designed to be overlooked, designed to survive a war zone, and designed to transmit a signal only a dog's sensitive ears, or a very specialized analyzer, could detect. I held the chip up to the spectrum analyzer. The 23 kHz spike was coming directly from the tiny piece of resin. Would needed to disable it without triggering any kind of final burst transmission. I couldn't just crush it. That might send a final high-power distress signal. I had to isolate it. I grabbed a roll of heavy-duty aluminum foil I kept in my go bag, always useful for shielding electronics or starting a fire. I wrapped the tiny chip in 3 layers of foil, squeezing it tight. I held the foil-wrapped chip up to the analyzer again. The 23 kHz spike immediately flatlined. Success. We were off the grid. I let out a long breath, feeling the tension drain out of my shoulders for the first time since 2:37 a.m. "We're clean, buddy," I whispered to Ares, tossing the wrapped chip into the car's cup holder. "You're just a dog again, a very, very good dog." I got back on the highway, driving east. I had to call Thompson and give him the update. I pulled out my secure phone. It rang once, and Thompson answered instantly. "Riley, status." "Sir, I'm clean. I found the beacon. It was a microtransmitter, a ghost tag, embedded in Ares's harness. I've shielded it in foil. We are no longer broadcasting." Thompson let out a sound that was half relief, half anger. A ghost tag. I should have known. They developed those things specifically to track high-value assets during extraction. They must have planted it when you and Ares were treated for injuries after the ambush. "That fits, sir. It's what they used to turn my safety into their surveillance hub. You did good, Jake. You're ahead of them now. They'll be sweeping the airwaves for that 23 kHz signal, and when they don't find it, they'll know you've cut the cord. That's going to make them desperate. Where's the intercept, sir? We need to blend. Keep moving east on I-70. Get off at exit 135, the National Road exit. You know the place. There's a massive truck stop and rest area there, open 24/7. It's chaos. We need chaos right now." "I know it, sir. It's about 40 minutes from my current position." "Good. Here's the plan. When you arrive, you will abandon the black sedan immediately. Leave the keys in the ignition. Leave the captured radio on the passenger seat, tuned to the 23 kHz frequency, but without the ghost tag. We want them to think they still have a lock on. The car, not on you." "Understood. Decoy." "Exactly. You and Ares will proceed to the main diner area. I have a team, 3 men, all plainclothes, waiting for you. Look for a man reading a copy of The Old Man and the Sea at the counter. Give him the hard drive. Do not speak, do not stop. Just hand it over and keep moving to the back exit. We'll secure you and Ares from there." "What about the ghost tag, sir?" "Keep it. It's evidence. Now move." "Riley, I'm seeing increased chatter on regional frequencies. They're mobilizing ground assets to sweep the highway." I hung up and checked the car clock. 4:30 a.m. Dawn was an hour away. The next 40 minutes were pure focus. I drove exactly the speed limit, trying to look like a tired traveler, while my eyes constantly scanned the road and the sky. I saw 2 dark sedans that looked suspiciously like the one I stole, but they passed us without incident. The lack of the ultrasonic beacon had clearly scrambled their immediate pursuit. I found exit 135. The truck stop was huge, a sprawling complex of diesel pumps, parking lots, and bright neon signs advertising cheap coffee and showers. It was exactly what Thompson promised: glorious, overwhelming, anonymous chaos. I pulled the black sedan into a remote corner of the parking lot, near a row of massive tractor trailers. I opened the door and grabbed my go bag, the hard drive, and the captured comms radio. I placed the radio on the passenger seat, tuning it to 23 kHz, setting the volume just loud enough to generate faint static. I left the keys dangling. "Let's go, Aries," I said, putting his leash on. He was harnessless now, just a massive, beautiful dog, but he moved with the same disciplined focus. We walked away from the sedan. I didn't look back. The car was now a bomb, waiting to confuse the enemy. The truck stop was a madhouse. Truckers were pulling in and out. People were stretching, smoking, arguing on their phones. We blended right into the noise. Aries walked right by my side, calm despite the crowds and the smells. He was back on duty, moving through the noise but only listening for my commands. We entered the main building. The air was thick with the smell of old grease, coffee, and stale cigarettes. I scanned the diner counter. It was packed, and there he was, a man in a simple gray jacket sitting alone at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. He was reading a paperback book, worn and dog-eared. The Old Man and the Sea. He didn't look up, but as I approached, he shifted his hand slightly, exposing a small, discreet patch on his wrist, the same patch Thompson used for secure comms. I walked past him. As I did, I let the hard drive slip from my hand, dropping it silently onto the counter beside his elbow. The man didn't flinch. His hand, quick as a snake, covered the hard drive, securing it under the cover of the book. "Back exit," he murmured without moving his lips or looking at me. I kept walking, Aries moving smoothly beside me. We passed the restrooms, the souvenir racks, and finally the back exit, which led to a service alley and another small parking lot. I pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold, damp, pre-dawn air. And that's where Thompson was waiting. Not Thompson himself, but his team. 3 large, well-built men and 1 woman, all wearing dark, nondescript jackets, standing around a massive black SUV that looked like it was built for a war zone. They moved instantly. Before I could take 3 steps, the woman was on me, checking my body for wires and weapons. The 2 men secured Aries, checking his paws and his mouth. "Riley," one of the men said, his voice clipped and professional. "We have the asset. Get in the vehicle." I didn't argue. I didn't even ask for names. I just followed orders, exhausted and running on fumes. They ushered Aries into the back of the SUV, which was lined with protective webbing. I slid into the middle seat. The man who spoke, the team leader, I assumed, slammed the door shut and the SUV moved out immediately, silent and fast. "You're secure, Riley," the leader said, handing me a bottle of water. "Sergeant Major Thompson is en route. He's diverting to Fort Wayne to meet us. We'll be there in 3 hours." "The hard drive?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "In the hands of our analysts. They're already working the decryption. We need to debrief you immediately on the CNC hub and the operator." I spent the next hour giving them every detail. The green box on the tree, the 3-pulse signal, the tapped power line, the accelerated timer, the relay in the neighbor's garage, the layout of the storage unit, and the face of the operator. They listened intently, taking notes on encrypted tablets. They were calm, utterly focused, and completely professional. A stark contrast to the frantic solo operation I had just run. The acoustic charges, the woman finally summarized. You believe they were designed to detonate on the 22 kHz frequency? Yes. The triple pulse was the synchronized trigger. The continuous 22 kHz broadcast was a frequency overload. It should have fried the acoustic sensors or at least rendered them inert. We'll send EOD teams in immediately to confirm. Your actions likely saved thousands of lives, Riley. This wasn't a local terrorist plot. This was a highly sophisticated, foreign-backed attempt at massive civilian destabilization. I just nodded, watching Ares in the rearview mirror. He was lying down now, finally relaxed, but his eyes were still open, tracking the motion of the vehicle. We need to get Ares checked, I said. I hit him with pure ultrasonic energy. He was in pain. We know, the leader replied gently. Thompson has a specialized K9 trauma team waiting at Fort Wayne. They'll run full diagnostics. They already have the protocol for acoustic shock. The tension eased slightly. Ares was finally getting the care he deserved, care that didn't involve me assaulting his sensory organs to stop a bomb. 3 hours later, as the sun was finally cresting the horizon, painting the sky in fiery orange and pink, we pulled into the secure perimeter of Fort Wayne Air National Guard Base. The security was tight. We were met by heavily armed MP platoons. The SUV drove directly into a secure underground facility, a place designed to handle high-value intelligence assets. Sergeant Major Thompson was waiting for us. He looked older, more tired than I remembered, but his handshake was firm and his eyes were sharp. "Riley," he said, gripping my shoulder, "you and Ares exceeded every expectation. You were right the whole time." "Thank you, sir, but Ares needs attention." Thompson nodded toward a separate door. "We're on it. K9 team is waiting." They took Ares away first. It was the hardest moment letting him go, even into the hands of professionals. He looked back at me, a silent question in his eyes, but he went with the handler without resistance. Thompson led me to a small, windowless debriefing room. "The hard drive is giving us everything," Thompson said, pouring me a cup of black coffee that tasted like jet fuel. "The cell identity, their funding sources, and more, importantly, the full schematic of the acoustic charges. You were right. Your 22 kHz broadcast rendered them inert. We're sweeping the neighborhood now. It's a miracle. I just followed Ares, sir. He heard the signal. That's the point, Riley. You trusted your partner when everyone else dismissed his reaction as PTSD. That's why you're here and the bomb network is neutralized." We spent the next 6 hours in intense debriefing, going over the map I drew, identifying the operator, a low-level technician with ties to a foreign intelligence service, and detailing the sequence of events. Thompson kept coming back to the ghost tag. "They tracked you for weeks, Jake. They knew your routine. They were waiting for the opportune moment. They didn't want to kill you at home. They wanted to frame you for the detonation, creating maximum chaos and fear. And they used Ares as the final piece of the puzzle," I said, leaning back, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes. "Yes. The dog who saves the day is then revealed to be the source of the chaos. It's dark, Jake. Very dark." Finally, the debriefing ended. I felt like I had been wrung dry. Thompson stood up. "Go see your partner, Riley. He's done with diagnostics." I walked down the sterile hallway to the K9 medical bay. The air smelled of antiseptic, but also reassuringly of dog fur. Ares was lying on a padded examination table, looking slightly groggy. A veterinarian, a young woman in scrubs named Dr. Chen, was checking his vitals. "How is he, Doc?" I asked immediately. Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "He's amazing, Jake. His internal systems are fine. We ran a full neurological panel. The ultrasonic exposure was agonizing, but it didn't cause any permanent damage. His auditory processing is already recovering. He's just exhausted." I walked over and put my hand on Ares's head. He immediately leaned into my touch, letting out a deep, satisfied sigh. "I'm sorry, buddy," I murmured. I had to. Ares licked my hand, a gesture of immediate forgiveness. Dr. Chen handed me a sealed plastic bag. Inside was the tiny, foil-wrapped ghost tag. "We ran the analysis on this little guy," she explained. "It's a masterpiece of miniaturization. It broadcasts a continuous signal, but it has a secondary function. It acts as a passive acoustic receiver. It was recording everything Ares heard and relaying it back to the CNC hub along with the tracking signal." So they weren't just tracking us, I realized, feeling a fresh wave of horror. They were listening to everything Ares detected, every footstep, every whisper, every anomaly. "Exactly," Dr. Chen confirmed. "They were using his hypervigilance as their primary intelligence, gathering tool." I gripped the bag tight. This small, silent chip represented the true genius of the enemy, a complete inversion of military intelligence, turning the hunter into the hunted's ear. Thompson walked back into the room. "We're done here, Riley. You and Ares are going to a secure facility for a few weeks. We need to process the data and ensure this cell is completely neutralized." "What about the operator?" "He's being transferred to a high-security black site. He won't be talking to anyone outside of our interrogators." Thompson paused, looking at me and Ares. "But before you go, there's one more thing. The men who attacked you at the CNC hub, the 2 guards you subdued, they were picked up by the dark cargo van shortly after you drove off. We have footage from traffic cams." My stomach tightened. "The guy who waved at me at the truck stop." "Yes, he's their field commander. We believe highly experienced, and he didn't leave empty-handed." "What did they take, sir? I secured the hard drive and the comms." Thompson looked grim. "They went back to the storage unit. They weren't interested in the server racks. They were interested in the operator's personal effects. Specifically, they took a small, customized laptop and a set of encrypted keys." "What were those keys for?" "We don't know yet, but the operator was talking about a next phase if the dispersal sequence failed. We believe those keys are linked to a secondary, much larger asset." Thompson leaned in, his voice dropping. "Jake, your actions bought us time, and you neutralized the immediate threat. But this cell, they don't quit. They failed to detonate the acoustic charges, so they've pivoted. They know you and Ares are the reason they failed. You're their highest priority target now." "So, the war isn't over," I stated flatly. "No, it just got bigger. We found something else in the CNC hard drive data, a secondary target map, activated only if the primary mission failed." Thompson pulled up an image on his tablet and rotated it so I could see. It was a topographic map of the region, but highlighted in bright, ominous red was a single, massive location. It was the main reservoir for the entire Ohio Valley, the massive man-made lake that supplied water to millions of people, including Columbus and Cincinnati. "The acoustic charges were a diversion, Jake," Thompson explained. "They were designed to tie up all first responders and intelligence assets in the suburbs. While we were focused on Springfield, they were planning to hit the reservoir. How? We don't know the method yet, but the secondary asset they are now activating, the one linked to those encrypted keys, is aimed at the water supply. We believe they have some kind of large-scale dispersal agent ready to deploy." I looked at Ares, who was resting his head on my knee, calm and oblivious to the new, massive threat we faced. We were safe now, secure inside a military base, but the enemy was still out there, mobilized, and planning an attack that would dwarf the suburban chaos they had initially intended. "Sir," I said, standing up, feeling a renewed surge of energy despite the exhaustion. "I need to be on the team that tracks them down. Ares and I, we know how they think. We know their frequencies." Thompson looked at me, a long, assessing stare. He didn't argue. "I figured you'd say that, Riley. Get some rest. We're launching the operation at 1800 hours. You and Ares are designated high-value assets. You're going to be leading the counter-surveillance and detection phase." He looked down at Ares. "The enemy thinks the dog is silenced. We're going to use that. We're going to let them think they've won the information war, and then we're going to turn Ares into the biggest, quietest trap they've ever walked into." Thompson handed me a fresh, sealed harness for Ares. Standard issue, but modified. "We're going back out, Jake. The quiet life will have to wait." I took the harness and looked at Ares. He saw the gear and his tail gave a single, strong thump against the examination table. He was ready. The silent signal that had plagued my nights in Ohio was gone, but the war it signaled was far from over. It had just moved to a much larger and much more dangerous battlefield. The clock was ticking again, and this time, the stakes were measured in millions of lives and gallons of water. We had 15 hours until the next phase of the operation began, and Ares and I were going to be waiting for them. The search for the ghost tag was over, but the hunt for the ghost cell was just beginning. The sun was just a promise of light when Thompson's team finished the final briefing. The operation was codenamed Silent Sweep. "We have 15 hours until the enemy's next window," Thompson stated, leaning over a topographic map of the Ohio Valley Reservoir. "That reservoir, Jake, it holds enough water to supply 5 major cities. If they contaminate that, it's catastrophic. They're using the keys they stole to activate the secondary asset, which we believe is a remotely piloted delivery system, likely a drone or submersible." I looked at the map, at the massive, intricate structure of the dam and the surrounding purification plants. It was too big to secure entirely. "They'll focus on the most vulnerable access point," I said, pointing to a small, isolated pumping station near the deep water intake tunnel. "Low visibility, easy for a submersible launch." "Exactly," Thompson confirmed. "That's our insertion point. They think they're still tracking Ares via the ghost tag frequency, even though the signal dropped when you shielded it. We're going to use that confusion. We're deploying jamming equipment across the suburbs now, making them think we're desperately trying to find the source of the 23 kHz broadcast. Meanwhile, you and Ares go silent." Ares was brought back into the briefing room wearing his new gear, a lightweight, sterile harness, thoroughly checked for any foreign components. He looked ready, his eyes bright with focus. Thompson handed me a small, encrypted satellite phone. "This is your only communication link. You go dark the moment you leave this base. Your job is simple. Find the threat. Ares is the only sensor we have that can detect whatever they're using to deliver the payload, whether it's a high-frequency acoustic trigger or the scent of the agent itself." "We're ready, sir." We were flown out just before dusk. The insertion was textbook, a quiet helicopter drop 5 miles from the pumping station, followed by a long, silent hike through dense, cold forest. The air around the reservoir was heavy, humid, and smelled strongly of ozone and fresh water. It was a beautiful, overwhelming kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that feels fragile. I moved through the trees, Ares walking point, his nose low to the damp earth. We were wearing full tactical gear, but Ares was completely unencumbered, relying solely on his senses. The pumping station was a squat concrete building nestled near the waterline. It was dark except for the faint yellow emergency lights glowing inside. Thompson's team had secured the exterior perimeter hours ago, but they hadn't breached the building yet. They were waiting for us to confirm the threat was inside. Ares didn't react to the building. He was focused on the water. We moved along the shoreline, the sound of the waves lapping against the concrete making everything else feel deafeningly loud. Then Ares stopped. He didn't freeze or whine. He just lowered his entire body, flattening himself against the wet sand, his ears swiveling. He inhaled deeply, a long, careful pull of air. He was scenting the water. I knelt beside him, checking the satellite phone. No signal. We were truly alone. Ares began to move again, agonizingly slowly, tracking something invisible that was drifting just above the surface of the lake. The scent was coming from the center of the lake, moving toward the deep intake tunnel near the main dam structure, the most critical point. We tracked, ascent for a quarter-mile, moving past massive, rusted pipes and concrete abutments. Ares was completely locked in, his tail low, his breathing shallow. We reached a small, isolated maintenance dock, barely visible in the gathering darkness. The dock was old, slippery with moss, and led out about 20 feet over the deep water. Ares stopped at the edge of the dock and pointed his nose straight down into the black water. I looked down. Nothing visible. Just the endless dark surface. But Ares was vibrating. Not the panicked tension from the triple pulse, but a focused professional tremor. He had found it. I pulled out a small thermal imaging scope. I scanned the water, and there it was. Just below the surface, barely breaking the temperature of the cold lake water, was a shape. It was about 8 feet long, sleek, and moving slowly toward the intake tunnel. It was a custom-built, remotely piloted submersible drone, the secondary asset. And then I saw the launch control. A small gray maintenance shed sat at the end of the dock. The door was slightly ajar, a faint line of light visible from inside. I signaled Ares to halt and stay low. I moved toward the shed, Glock raised, every sense heightened. I slipped inside. The shed was small, filled with old fishing gear and utility boxes. But in the center, resting on a folding table, was a laptop, glowing with blue light. And standing over it, his back to me, was the field commander, the man from the cargo van at the truck stop. He was focused intensely on the screen, typing rapidly. He was wearing the same dark baseball cap. He was executing the final launch sequence. He had the stolen keys plugged into the side of the laptop. I raised the Glock, aiming center mass. Hands where I can see them. Now. The commander didn't jump. He moved with practiced, terrifying calm. He slowly raised his hands, but his eyes never left the screen. "You're late, Riley," he said, his voice flat, accented. "I assumed you would realize the ghost tag was a receiver, not just a transmitter. You wasted valuable time chasing a silent frequency." "It's over," I said, stepping closer. "The charges are neutralized. The hub is secured. Drop the keys." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The charges were a decoy, soldier, a distraction. This is the real prize." He glanced at the screen. "You have 30 seconds before the submersible reaches the intake valve. You can shoot me, but you can't stop the sequence." He was bluffing. Or he wasn't. I couldn't risk the shot. I knew the moment I moved to disable the laptop, he would fight. And if he hit a failsafe or a quick release key, the submersible could dump its payload instantly. "Ares!" I yelled, the command shattering the quiet of the shed. "Secure the target. Disable the hands." Ares, who had been waiting silently outside, burst through the shed door. He didn't waste movement. He didn't go for the neck or the legs. He went straight for the commander's forearms, pinning them instantly to the table. The commander screamed, a sharp, ragged sound of sudden agony and surprise. Ares's grip was absolute, non-lethal, but paralyzing. I rushed forward, slamming the Glock onto the table and ripped the customized encrypted keys out of the laptop port. The screen immediately flashed an error code. The launch sequence stopped dead. I looked at the submersible's status. It was stalled, 20 feet from the intake valve. "It's over," I repeated, kicking the folding table away from the commander. He was still pinned by Ares, gasping for breath, staring up at me with pure hatred. "You should have stayed home, veteran," he spat, blood trickling from his lip. "You're a ghost of a dead war. You don't belong here." "I belong wherever my dog tells me the threat is," I corrected him. I grabbed the satellite phone and keyed the preset emergency code. "Thompson, this is Riley. Threat neutralized, submersible stalled, target secured." A moment later, Thompson's voice crackled, full of relief. "Confirmed. Riley, stand by. Insertion team inbound." I backed away from the commander, keeping the Glock aimed at his head. Aries maintained the perfect heavy pressure, ensuring no sudden movements. The subsequent hours were a blur of military precision. Thompson's team arrived via fast attack boats, securing the submersible and the commander. They recovered the payload, a sophisticated chemical agent designed to rapidly contaminate large bodies of water. I spent the rest of the night debriefing Thompson inside a secure tent near the dam. The hard drive from the CNC hub, combined with the commander's laptop, gave them the entire network, a global cell specialized in high-tech, deniable terrorism. "You saved us from a national crisis, Jake," Thompson said, shaking my hand firmly. "The silence you heard, the frequency Aries detected, it wasn't just a localized threat, it was the first domino. Aries was the only reason we knew it was a signal, sir, not a nightmare." Thompson smiled, a genuine, tired smile. "I've already submitted the paperwork, Jake. Full commendation for both of you. And there's one more thing." He pulled a small official document from his jacket. It was Aries's retirement papers, stamped and signed, but with one crucial addition. The Department of Defense has officially designated Aries as a validated sensory asset, and his reactions to the 22 kHz and 23 kHz frequencies are now being used to develop new counter-surveillance protocols. He wasn't wrong, Jake. He was just ahead of the curve. Aries' anxiety, his hypervigilance, his reaction to the phantom sound, it wasn't a flaw. It was a validated, critical defense mechanism. The war had followed us home, but Aries had provided the tools to win it. 2 days later, Aries and I were back in Springfield. The house was clean. Thompson's team had repaired the broken window and swept the entire property for any remaining traces of the enemy operation. Sarah had dropped off a fresh casserole and a mountain of mail. I sat on the porch swing, sipping a cold soda, watching Aries patrol the perimeter of the yard. He wasn't tense, he was just enjoying the green grass and the cool Ohio air. It took time to settle back in. The memories of the chase, the ultrasonic shriek, the smell of ozone in the storage unit, those wouldn't fade easily. But the external threat was gone. The ghost cell was dismantled. That night, I went to bed early. I didn't set an alarm. I didn't set up the spectrum analyzer. I just lay there, the windows open, letting the real sounds of the suburban night filter in. Crickets, a distant train horn, the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Aries lay beside the bed, curled up in a heavy, contented lump, his breathing deep and steady. I watched the clock on the dresser. I waited. I couldn't help it. My body was still wired for the jump scare. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. My heart started to pound faintly as the minute hand crawled toward the familiar, terrible time. 2:36 a.m. I held my breath, waiting for the scrape of claws on the hardwood, the rigid posture, the focused stare. 2:37 a.m. The clock ticked over, and nothing happened. Aries didn't move. He didn't twitch. He didn't even lift his head. He gave a soft, sleepy snort, shifted slightly, and continued his deep, rhythmic sleep. The house was quiet. Deeply, truly quiet. The kind of quiet I had been fighting for. The kind of quiet that meant safety, not surveillance. I lay there for a long time, listening to the silence, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of Aries's breathing. The war was over. The silent signal was gone. I reached down and placed my hand on Aries's thick fur. He sighed contentedly, leaning into my touch. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in what felt like years, I finally, completely fell asleep. We were home, and we were finally at peace.